Right now, something unusual is happening inside American grocery stores and big box retailers. Shoppers aren't just buying what they need for the week anymore. They're quietly filling carts with extra coffee, stacking canned food in bulk, and grabbing items that normally wouldn't cross their minds twice. To a casual observer, it might look like normal shopping behavior, but economists say it's actually the early signal of something much bigger. Across the United States, consumers are beginning to stockpile everyday essentials before prices surge again in 2006, driven by a combination of import tariffs, global crop disruptions, and fragile supply chains that still haven't fully recovered from the last few years of shocks. Recent reports suggest many of the products Americans rely on every day could soon see price increases ranging from 10 to 30%, particularly items that depend heavily on imports or climate-sensitive agriculture. Analysts point to several pressure points building at the same time. Trade tensions that may raise tariffs on foreign goods, shrinking livestock herds pushing meat costs higher, and extreme weather affecting key crops like coffee and cocoa around the world. Even the U.S. Department of Agriculture has warned that grocery inflation could continue climbing this year, forecasting food price increases between 2.4% and 4%, with tariffs potentially pushing that even higher. But what makes this moment especially interesting is the psychology behind how people react to rising prices. Consumer behavior studies show that when people expect inflation, they don't simply adjust their budgets, they change their buying habits entirely. Instead of purchasing one item, they buy three. Instead of waiting for the next shopping trip, they stock up immediately. It's a pattern economists call anticipatory buying, and it often happens quietly before the broader public even realizes a price wave is coming. That's why, long before headlines start warning about higher grocery bills, subtle signals start appearing in supermarkets, warehouses, and online retail trends. And right now, those signals are everywhere. Retail data and economic reports show that certain everyday products are being bought faster than usual, especially items that are either import-dependent, climate-affected, or shelf-stable enough to store for months. From coffee and olive oil to canned foods and household essentials, these purchases reveal how consumers are preparing for what they believe could be another round of price spikes. Some of these items may surprise you, while others will make perfect sense once you understand what's happening behind the scenes in global supply chains. So the real question is this: what exactly are Americans rushing to buy before prices rise again? And why are these specific products suddenly becoming stockpile targets across the country? Because when you look closely, the list reveals a fascinating story about the global economy, changing consumer instincts, and the early warning signs of inflation that most people miss until it's too late. And the first item on that list might already be sitting in your kitchen. Let's be honest about something most financial headlines won't tell you directly. Inflation never really left. It slowed down, yes. The Federal Reserve raised rates, yes. Politicians gave speeches about winning the fight. But if you've been to a grocery store in the last 12 months, you already know the truth in your bones. Things are still expensive, and something in the air right now feels like it's about to get worse. So what exactly is different about 2026? Why are economists, retail analysts, and ordinary families all arriving at the same uneasy conclusion at the same time? Three forces have collided simultaneously, and that collision is what makes this moment genuinely unlike anything we've seen in the last 2 decades. The first force is tariffs. The United States has implemented sweeping new tariff structures on imports from dozens of countries, and while the political debate about whether that's good or bad for America long-term is complicated, the short-term math is remarkably simple. When a product costs more to bring into the country, the retailer pays more, the distributor pays more, and eventually, always without exception, the consumer pays more. The USDA has already forecasted grocery inflation running between 2.4 and 4% in 2026. But that number was calculated before the full weight of new tariff structures was factored into supply chain pricing. Independent economists and retail analysts now believe the real number for specific categories could run significantly higher, between 10 and 30% on imported goods, depending on the product and its country of origin. The second force is climate. This isn't political commentary. It's agricultural data. Coffee yields in Brazil and Vietnam, which together supply the majority of the world's coffee, have been hit by irregular rainfall patterns and temperature shifts that have directly reduced harvests. Cocoa production in West Africa, particularly in Ivory Coast and Ghana, has been devastated by a combination of disease, drought, and aging tree stock. Olive harvests across southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece, have now suffered multiple consecutive difficult seasons. These aren't projections. These are already documented crop failures that have already reduced global supply. When supply drops and demand stays the same, price goes up. That's not ideology. That's arithmetic. The third force is something quieter and arguably more dangerous than the other two. It's timing. All of these pressures are arriving at the same moment that American household savings rates have dropped back down to historically low levels following the post-pandemic spending surge. The average American family has less financial cushion today than they did in 2019, which means that when prices rise, not if, when families will feel it faster, with less buffer, and with fewer options. Put those three forces together and you start to understand why what's happening right now in retail is not irrational panic. It's something closer to informed instinct. People are sensing, correctly, that the window to buy at current prices is narrowing. And the 15 items we're about to walk through are the clearest evidence of that instinct playing out in real time, in real shopping carts across the country right now. The third force is something quieter and arguably more dangerous than the other two. It's timing. All of these pressures are arriving at the same moment that American household savings rates have dropped back down to historically low levels following the post-pandemic spending surge. The average American family has less financial cushion today than they did in 2019, which means that when prices rise, not if when, families will feel it faster, with less buffer and with fewer options. Put those three forces together, and you start to understand why what's happening right now in retail is not irrational panic. It's something closer to informed instinct. People are sensing, correctly, that the window to buy at current prices is narrowing. And the 15 items we're about to walk through are the clearest evidence of that instinct playing out in real time, in real shopping carts across the country right now. Let's start in your kitchen. Because before we talk about electronics, or auto parts, or clothing, the place most American families are going to feel this first, and feel it hardest, is in their grocery cart. And the items we're about to walk through aren't luxury goods. They're not extras. They are the foundational staples of the American household. And every single one of them is under pressure right now from multiple directions at once. Let's start with coffee. And not because it's first on the list, but because the story behind what's happening to coffee prices right now is one of the most complete illustrations of how all three forces, tariffs, climate, and timing, converge on a single product. Brazil is the world's largest coffee producer. Vietnam is the second largest. Together, they supply the overwhelming majority of the coffee consumed in the United States. Both countries have experienced significant yield disruptions over the last two growing seasons. In Brazil, irregular frost followed by drought in key growing regions damaged crops in ways that take years, not months, to recover from. In Vietnam, similar weather volatility reduced Robusta bean harvests. At the same time, new tariff structures have added an additional cost layer to every pound of coffee entering the United States. The projected result is a price increase of approximately 20% on coffee. That's not a small number. For a family that buys 2 bags of coffee a month, that's real money every single week for the foreseeable future. Now move along the breakfast table to something even more fundamental. Eggs. Americans have been living with egg price volatility for over 2 years now, driven primarily by the most widespread avian influenza outbreak in United States history. Tens of millions of egg-laying hens have been culled since the outbreak began, and while flocks have been partially rebuilt, the virus has not been eradicated. New outbreaks continue to emerge in farming regions across the Midwest and Southeast, creating a cycle of supply disruption that simply hasn't stabilized. What makes eggs particularly painful as a price story is that they function as a staple ingredient across so many other food categories: baked goods, restaurant meals, processed foods. So when egg prices rise, the ripple effect touches far more than just the breakfast aisle. Then there's beef. The American cattle herd has been quietly shrinking for years, and 2006 finds it at one of its smallest sizes in decades. This happened for a combination of reasons. Prolonged drought in key ranching states forced many ranchers to sell off cattle early rather than pay for expensive supplemental feed, which reduced herd sizes faster than normal breeding cycles can replace them. At the same time, feed costs, fuel costs for transportation, and energy costs for processing have all remained elevated. The result is a beef supply that is genuinely tighter than it has been in a very long time, hitting the market at exactly the moment when consumer demand remains strong. Prices at the meat counter have already moved. They are expected to continue moving. Chocolate is next, and this one deserves special attention because the number attached to it is startling. a projected price increase of approximately 70% on cocoa and chocolate products. 70. That's not a rounding error. That's not an outlier estimate from a fringe analyst. That reflects the documented reality of what has happened to cocoa markets globally over the last 18 months. Ivory Coast and Ghana together produce roughly 60% of the world's cocoa. Both countries have been battling a lethal combination of a plant disease called cacao swollen shoot virus, erratic rainfall, and decades of underinvestment in orchard renewal, meaning many of the trees being harvested right now are old, less productive, and more vulnerable to disease. Global cocoa futures hit record highs. Major chocolate manufacturers have already quietly reduced package sizes while maintaining prices, a practice economists call shrinkflation, and further outright price increases are now being built into retail contracts for 2026. Olive oil follows a similar climate-driven pattern. Spain is the world's largest producer of olive oil and has now endured several consecutive difficult harvest seasons driven by extreme heat and drought across Andalusia, the country's primary olive-growing region. Italy and Greece have faced comparable challenges. The result is a global olive oil supply that has been significantly reduced at exactly the moment when American consumer demand for olive oil has been rising steadily for years. Tariffs compound this further. Imported olive oil now carries additional cost burdens that get passed directly to the consumer. If you've already noticed that your usual bottle of olive oil costs noticeably more than it did 2 years ago, you're not imagining it, and the trajectory has not reversed. Sugar and dairy, cheese, milk, butter, round out the core grocery story. And while they don't carry single dramatic headlines the way cocoa does, they represent something arguably more consequential because of how deeply embedded they are in everything else we buy. Sugar is an input cost for thousands of processed foods. Dairy is foundational to restaurant supply chains, bakeries, and home cooking alike. When feed costs for dairy cattle rise, when energy costs for processing plants rise, when transportation costs rise, every one of those increases flows downstream into the price of milk on the shelf and cheese at the deli counter. The USDA's baseline grocery inflation forecast of 2.4 to 4% is largely being driven by exactly these staple categories. And that forecast, as we noted earlier, was built before the full tariff picture was priced in. Canned goods, tuna, beans, lentils, deserve a specific mention because they represent the smart shopper's traditional safe harbor during inflationary periods. They're shelf-stable, protein-rich, and historically affordable. The challenge in 2026 is that even this category is seeing cost pressure from two directions: the commodity cost of the food itself and the cost of the steel and aluminum used in the cans, both of which are subject to tariff impacts. This doesn't mean canned goods stop being good value. They remain among the best value options available. But it does mean the window to stock up at current prices is genuinely limited. Bread and flour complete the grocery picture. Grain markets have been volatile globally, influenced by weather events in key wheat-producing regions and ongoing disruptions to international grain trade routes. Fuel costs affect every step of the bread supply chain, from farming equipment to milling to delivery trucks. The family loaf of bread is in many ways a perfect summary of the entire inflation story. It touches climate, energy, transportation, and trade all at once. And its price is among the most psychologically visible to ordinary consumers because it's bought so frequently. What ties all of these food items together is not just that they're getting more expensive, it's that they're getting more expensive for structural reasons that don't have quick fixes. You can't rebuild a cattle herd in a quarter. You can't regrow an olive grove in a season. You can't reverse a cocoa tree disease outbreak with a policy announcement. These are slow-moving, deeply rooted supply problems colliding with fast-moving trade policy changes. And the American consumer is standing at the intersection of both. Here's where the story shifts in a way that catches a lot of people off guard. Because when we talk about food prices rising, there's a psychological acceptance that comes with it. Food is seasonal. Food is weather-dependent. We've been through grocery inflation before, and we understand, at least instinctively, that harvests fail and commodity prices move. It's uncomfortable, but it's familiar. What's harder to process, and what's generating a different and in some ways more urgent wave of consumer behavior right now, is watching the price of your phone, your car parts, and your children's shoes get swept up in the same economic current. These feel like stable, manufactured, predictable products. They're made in factories. They follow schedules. They shouldn't be subject to the same volatility as a coffee harvest in Brazil or a cocoa grove in West Africa. And yet here we are. Let's start with electronics, and specifically smartphones. Because the story here is both technically fascinating and genuinely consequential for tens of millions of American households. The global semiconductor industry, the foundation upon which every modern electronic device is built, has been navigating a complex restructuring over the last several years. The push to reduce dependence on Asian chip manufacturing, while strategically sound over the long term, has created a transitional period where supply constraints are real. New domestic capacity is not yet fully online, and existing inventory pipelines are being managed with unusual caution by manufacturers. At the same time, the tariff picture for electronics imported from key manufacturing countries is significant. Smartphones, laptops, tablets, and accessories that are assembled in China, Vietnam, and other tariff-affected countries now carry additional cost burdens at the border. Apple, Samsung, and other major brands have been absorbing some of these costs to protect market share. But that absorption has limits, and analysts tracking retail pricing in the electronics sector are widely expecting visible price adjustments in the 2026 product cycle. The AARP, which tracks consumer pricing with particular attention to how it affects fixed-income households, has flagged electronics as one of the categories most likely to see tariff-driven price increases that affect everyday Americans directly and significantly. What makes electronics different from food as a panic-buying category is the replacement cycle. Nobody stockpiles 5 smartphones. But what millions of Americans are doing right now is accelerating a purchase they were planning to make anyway, upgrading a phone that still works but was going to be replaced in 6 months, buying a laptop for a college student a semester earlier than planned, picking up a tablet or smart home device before the next price adjustment hits. This is rational consumer behavior, not panic. It's the recognition that if you were going to spend that money anyway, the smartest time to spend it is before the price goes up. Clothing and footwear tell a related but distinct story, and it's one that affects families with children particularly sharply, because children's clothing isn't optional and it isn't deferrable. Kids grow, seasons change, and school dress codes don't negotiate. The overwhelming majority of clothing and footwear sold in the United States is manufactured in Asia, China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia. All of these manufacturing countries are affected to varying degrees by new tariff structures. The arithmetic is straightforward. When import costs rise on finished clothing, the price tag at the retail level follows. What's notable about clothing is that unlike electronics, where consumers can sometimes delay a purchase cycle, the demand for clothing is continuous and non-negotiable for families. A family with 3 school-age children buying clothing at the beginning of every school year has no option to simply wait this out. The purchases have to happen, and if they happen 6 months from now, they will likely happen at higher prices. Footwear deserves specific mention because it sits at the intersection of multiple tariff pressure points. The materials, the manufacturing, and the country of origin are all factors that compound the cost increase. Athletic shoes in particular, which have become a wardrobe staple across all age groups, are manufactured almost exclusively in tariff-affected countries and represent a category where price increases of 15 to 25% are considered realistic by retail analysts tracking import cost data. Auto parts bring a completely different psychological weight to this conversation, and if you own a vehicle, which the vast majority of American households do, this category deserves your full attention. The American automotive supply chain is among the most globally integrated manufacturing ecosystems in the world. Components for vehicles sold and driven in the United States come from dozens of countries, and a significant portion of those countries are now inside the tariff impact zone. What unites all of these non-food categories, electronics, clothing, footwear, auto parts, batteries, is something important that separates them psychologically from the grocery conversation. With food, people understand the concept of seasonal price variation even if they don't like it. But with manufactured goods, there is a deeply held consumer expectation that prices should be stable or even decline over time as manufacturing efficiency improves. When that expectation is violated, when the phone costs more this year than last year, when the sneakers cost more, when the car part costs more, it triggers a different kind of anxiety. It's not just the financial impact, it's the sense that the rules have changed, that the assumptions people built their household budgets on are no longer reliable. And that psychological shift, that erosion of confidence and price stability, is arguably the most important economic story of 2026. Because when consumers lose confidence in stable prices, they change their behavior in ways that can themselves accelerate the very inflation they're trying to get ahead of. Economists call this an inflationary expectation spiral, and history, from the 1970s to more recent emerging market crises, shows that once it takes hold in consumer psychology, it is extremely difficult to reverse. The 15 items on this list are not just a shopping guide, they are a window into a broader economic moment that every American household is navigating right now, whether they realize it or not. Remember where we started. That grocery store in 1973. That woman on the phone. That quiet, creeping feeling that something fundamental was shifting, and the window to get ahead of it was closing faster than anyone had officially announced. We started there because history has a way of rhyming, and the most valuable thing any piece of financial journalism can do is help ordinary people hear that rhyme before it becomes a chorus they can no longer ignore. The easy version of this story is a shopping list. 15 items, buy them now, save money later. And that version is true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. Because what's happening in 22.6 is not really a story about coffee prices, or cocoa yields, or semiconductor tariffs. Those are the symptoms. The story, the real story, is about something much larger and much more important. It's about the relationship between ordinary American households and the global economic systems they depend on every single day, without ever thinking about them. When you pour a cup of coffee in the morning, you are the final link in a supply chain that stretches from a farm in Brazil through a shipping port in Santos, across the Pacific Ocean through a customs checkpoint into a roasting facility, onto a delivery truck, and into your local store. That chain has always been fragile. It has always been dependent on weather, politics, trade relationships, fuel prices, and dozens of other variables that no individual consumer controls or even sees. What's different now is that the fragility is visible. The variables are moving simultaneously and in the same direction, and the result is landing on kitchen tables and household budgets in ways that can no longer be explained away or waited out. This visibility is actually important. Not comfortable, but important. Because the periods in American economic history when consumers were most blindsided, most financially damaged, most left behind, were not the periods of visible disruption. They were the periods of invisible accumulation, the slow, quiet building of pressures that nobody talked about until they couldn't be ignored anymore. The 2008 financial crisis didn't begin with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. It began years earlier, in mortgage offices and credit rating agencies and bank risk departments, invisible to the families who would eventually lose their homes. The inflation surge of the early 2020s didn't begin with the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic. It began with monetary policy decisions and fiscal stimulus programs that were debated in rooms most Americans never heard about. What's happening now is more visible than either of those moments. The tariff decisions are public. The crop failure data is published. The supply chain stress indicators are being reported. And that visibility, uncomfortable as it is, gives ordinary consumers something they didn't have in 2008 or in early 2020. It gives them lead time. Not much lead time, but some. And some lead time, used wisely, is genuinely valuable. Here's what we want you to take away from everything you've heard today, and we want to say it as directly and as honestly as we can. Because you deserve that. The goal of understanding what's happening to prices right now is not to make you afraid. Fear is a terrible financial advisor. Fear makes you buy things you don't need. Fear makes you make decisions you'll regret. Fear at scale actually makes inflation worse, because it drives the exact demand surge that pushes prices higher faster. The goal of understanding what's happening is to make you clear about what the real pressures are, clear about which categories are genuinely affected and which are being overhyped, clear about what strategic preparation actually looks like versus what panic buying looks like, and clear about the most important financial principle that applies to every household regardless of income level or zip code. That knowledge, acted on calmly and intelligently, is the most powerful financial tool any family has. The 15 items on this list are a starting point, not a finish line. They represent the categories where the confluence of tariffs, climate disruption, and supply chain stress is most acute and most documented right now. But the broader discipline they point toward, understanding where your household's money goes, understanding which of your regular purchases are most vulnerable to external price pressures, and making thoughtful, forward-looking decisions rather than reactive ones. That discipline has value that extends far beyond any single inflationary period. Think about the families you know who seem to consistently navigate financial turbulence better than others. They're usually not the ones with the highest incomes. They're the ones with the clearest picture of their own financial situation. They know what they spend. They know what they need. They make decisions from a position of awareness rather than anxiety. They're not immune to economic headwinds, but they bend without breaking because their financial decisions are grounded in reality rather than driven by fear or hope or the assumption that things will simply work out. That is what this moment is asking of every American household. Not heroism, not sacrifice, not complex financial maneuvering. Just clarity, a clear look at what's coming, a clear assessment of your own situation, and a calm, deliberate set of decisions that reflect both. Because here's the final truth about moments like this. 1. And history bears this out completely. The economic disruption itself is rarely what determines which families come out the other side in better shape and which ones don't. What determines that is how people respond. The families who panicked in 1973 and made reactive, fear-driven decisions faced a harder road than the ones who looked at the situation clearly, made reasonable adjustments, and kept their financial footing. The families who panicked in 2020 and loaded their garages with toilet paper and hand sanitizer, while ignoring their savings and their debt levels, did not come out of that period ahead. The families who stayed calm, assessed their real needs, made thoughtful decisions, and kept their financial priorities in order, those families were more resilient. Resilience. That's the word we want to leave you with. Not because it sounds good, but because it is the actual practical outcome that smart financial behavior in moments like this one produces. A household that is resilient, that has a modest reserve of essentials, a clear budget, manageable debt, and decision-making habits grounded in information, rather than anxiety, is a household that can absorb the price increases coming in 2026 without being destabilized by them. And that resilience, built quietly and deliberately in moments exactly like this one, is worth infinitely more than any single smart purchase from any list of 15 items. The shelves aren't empty yet. The prices haven't all moved yet. The window hasn't closed. But it is narrowing, and now you know exactly what's in it, exactly what it means, and exactly what to do about it. That's not panic. That's power.